For the people who are always told what they can't do and then they prevail, that's what inspires me.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I'm so thrilled to introduce today's guest, a friend I've looked up to for a very long time, Carrie Hatch. Carrie is a battle-tested entrepreneur and brand advocate. She built her own company, a communications and advertising firm, into an industry leader, and along the way advised many of the world's most valuable brands how to accelerate growth and manage their reputations. Here are 3 things that I think you should know about Carrie. Number 1, at age 30, she purchased her employer, MDB Communications, and as CEO, she grew the firm into a leading communications and advertising powerhouse, sought after for its expertise. She sold MDB to Hart, where she now serves as senior counsel. Number 2, Carrie's widely regarded as an influential business leader. She's repeatedly been named to the Washington Business Journal's Power 100 and as an American Advertising Federation Silver Medal honoree. Number 3, Carrie's leadership in the community includes serving as chairman of the Mid-Atlantic Board of Governors for the American Association of Advertising Agencies, as well as positions on the Whitman Walker Foundation Board, the Greater Washington Board of Trade, and the $2 billion University System of Maryland Foundation. Carrie, you have been called many things, from brand advocate, board member, one of the 100 most powerful people in Washington, a woman who means business, trusted advisor, mentor, and of course, chief executive. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I got to tell you, I'm super excited for this conversation.
Well, me too. We were, talking before about how we've known each other for a while, and I've had a chance to get to know you. But this is a new format where, I get to ask you all of these questions and learn from you in a way I wouldn't have gotten the chance to otherwise. So thanks for being part of this. And to start, I just wondered, could you take us back to when you were 30-year-old owner and CEO of an advertising firm? What was that like?
It was exciting and a bit scary for sure, because you don't know what you don't know. But, it's interesting. Fear of failure is a very powerful feeling. And I certainly had that. For some people, it makes them catatonic. Other people, it's like gasoline. For me, it was gasoline. So it was an interesting time, because this is in the 80s and there weren't that many female owners. There were plenty of people, women in advertising and marketing communications, but not all that many in the ownership slot.
Yeah.
So for in large part, it was about learning what I didn't know and giving myself permission to try and to ask, questions and learn. And certainly it was long hours, but I recognized the importance of surrounding myself with information and the talent that I needed to be successful. So it was like the 4As, the Board of Trade, DC Chamber, and others, and really having talent around me that made up for my shortcomings. And I got to tell you, it was a tough time, but it was tremendously exciting and very rewarding.
You mentioned all those organizations, and I know building relationships is so important to you, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when you mentioned kind of the tough time, I remember one of the earliest times we met, and we just talked about starting a company and owning a company. I just remember you said, "Well, it's not for the faint of heart." And
Yeah.
that you've been through kind of a lot that you had to develop that grit and stamina to keep going.
Yeah. Well, grit is a ongoing thread and theme in my life, and so I appreciate you mentioning that. It not to be bitter and look behind me, but I got to a point where I started thinking, "Gosh, what are all the things I've had to live through?" And I put together a little short list. I mean, even when I purchased the company, within 3 months there was Black Friday, and there was a stock market crash, and then there was a regional recession for largely financial organizations and institutions in the early 90s. And then the dot-com boom and bust and Y2K and 9/11. And Fannie Mae was one of our largest accounts in 2008. So that was another challenge. And, you think about the Great Recession, you think about the pandemic. So when you say it's not for the faint of heart, yeah, don't sign up if you're not willing to go on a ride and make sure you've got the tenacity to see it through.
Yeah, as you talk through all those events, it would be a great lens to like have a Netflix series or something about leading an organization through all that.
Yeah, it was great fun, but it does test your mettle and it
Yeah,
tests your relationships and even your relationship with your family.
yeah,
Because let's face it, even though it's your firm, it impacts a lot more than just you.
100%. Yeah. Well, speaking of, I was saying a Netflix series, in the media world, you and I both love the film Rudy, which is the consummate underdog story. And I wonder, were you able to use being underestimated to your advantage? Because obviously you must have been underestimated in the industry. You were a young owner of a company. You were one of a few women, as you said. And so I wonder if you could just talk about that.
So I think it's such a constant reality and theme that I actually put together a button
Oh, if
that
for
I
those just
wear
listening, Carrie's holding this button up. I love it.
on my jeans jacket that says, "Go ahead, underestimate me. That'll be fun." Because again, it's harnessing kind of that aggravation
Yeah.
when other people define and sometimes minimize you, either publicly or privately. And for me, that became a challenge and a charge. It was like, wow, okay, game on. Because for me, it wasn't just about playing what I used to call on the girls' stage. I wanted to play on the big stage with everybody. So going through that became energizing for me in a way. It's the idea that sometimes you have to overperform to make sure that you're memorable, over deliver so that you're taken seriously. Those are all important things to consider. But it's also, you want to be a leader in your space. You want to be an influencer in your space. You want to leave a legacy for others. And being underestimated propelled me to do things that perhaps I wouldn't have done otherwise.
Mm. I'm wondering if you ever had a chance to go back to those people who underestimate the look at me now, look at what I did.
Well, here's an uncharitable remark. Some of those people aren't around anymore because their businesses went out of business.
Yeah. And you outlasted them for sure.
I used to say that one of my strategies was to outlive people.
Yeah, because didn't you tell me you had who was your relative that lived to be like over 100?
My grandmothers, well, on both sides, one lived till 102 and the other lived till 106. The one I'm closest to lived till 106. And boy, she was a tough bird. I mean, she was really tough, but an inspiration. This is
Yeah.
a woman who drove cross country in 1923 with three high school girlfriends. They had a Model T Ford and one revolver, and she was in charge of the revolver. That's the stock that I come from, Anthony.
Oh my gosh. Don't mess with you or your people. That's the lesson there. So you mentioned, sort of driving uh toward results there a second ago. And I want to just ask you about when we think about measuring success and measuring results. Obviously, there's ways you do that in your own business that has been so successful. But then for clients, there's so many ways that we can measure things today with real-time analytics. Sometimes uh, they're not always the easiest things, aren't always the best things to measure, but it can become kind of an obsession. And I wonder how you counsel other business leaders to think about measuring success, because the information we have instant access to these days is so different than it was even a short time ago.
No, you're 100% right. And I believe that it's our role as communications professionals to set up hard and soft metrics and have that conversation right up front. As part of a team, we want to make sure that we're supporting the CMO and the CFO in terms of data they can use in the boardroom. Occasionally, I'm there to present, to the board, but it depends how you put together that framework of performance, because one of the things you and I chatted about is not everything important is measurable and not everything measurable is important. Nonetheless, we all have, at least I believe, a fiduciary responsibility to demonstrate the value of that investment and what they're really getting in terms of a return on that investment. So, there are hard and soft metrics. There are things that you can do, instantaneously, virtually instantaneously. And there are things that really support the notion of results overnight, brand over time. So, getting alignment there philosophically with the C-suite is key to this. But when you start out in the right place with those expectations, those metrics, you generally end up in a better place as well.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, sometimes you're presenting to those boards, and other times you're on those boards, you're on the receiving end of those presentations. So you bring a unique perspective to how an organization measures and monitors its success.
Yes, that's right. And one of the things that I've been in several discussions with other C-suite executives, I also believe it's incumbent upon us in the marketing communications world to be fluent in the language of finance. It's not just our language. And sometimes as marketers, we get on our own cocoon and talk our own acronyms and what have you. We need to translate that into board speak. We need to get a seat at the table, to be taken seriously. It's important that you're fluent in finance and can demonstrate that value and what that really means.
I think that's such an important point when we think about influence, right? For anybody, for marketing, your lesson is you have to understand finance and board speak if you want to influence those decision makers and help them see what you're trying to, where you're leading them. But that's true for any leader in any area. Maybe the finance people also might need to learn a little bit of the marketing speak, right? If they're trying to collaborate there. If we don't get out of our own cocoon, as you said it, and get comfortable with the language of others, it's kind of hard to influence people who are outside of our sphere, isn't it?
Well, and they're not going to work that hard. Let's be honest. Human beings tend to do and repeat what they know and love and are familiar with. So we need to, I believe, as communications professionals, advance the conversation so that we can have a real dialogue and promote real understanding that an investment in marketing communications isn't a cost center, it's an investment in growth. Because I am a huge advocate for the idea that marketing communication is an economic driver, not just for our brand or our country. I believe it moves the world.
I love that. When you're a true believer in what you do, I think it has that contagion effect, doesn't it? Where other people get enthusiastic about it and they get on board with what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And we can prove that. We can go through economic cycles. We can talk about GDP and what that means, consumer confidence. There's so many, back to our conversation on data, there are data points that demonstrate that. So I've kind of been on a lifelong mission to make sure that our industry isn't looked at as, kind of a stepchild to other professional services. So, because this one is very real and it shows up on a balance sheet every day. And I believe it should be part of a boardroom conversation.
And I love the direction that you sort of took that in, Cary, because if we think, hey, I'm going to interview a marketing communications leader about influence, the natural thing would be, oh, how do you influence consumers? But you can't even get to that stage if you don't understand how to influence in the boardroom, how to influence in the C-suite, how to get people on board with why this is not just an expense, this is actually an investment. That all has to happen before you start thinking about what are the strategies and tactics I use to influence the end consumer.
Yeah, and you can kind of see if there's a breakthrough there and if you have common ground. But I believe it's our responsibility to lean into that, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Because and we talk about board constituencies and what that looks like in terms of board placements and lineup. It's generally people with finance background, with legal background. Sometimes it's technology background. I've been an advocate for the notion that this is a time, particularly now in the digital and global world, where someone with expertise and reputation management should be part of that consideration set to sit on corporate boards. Because when you think about what's happening, the voice of the consumer, who has that voice in the boardroom? And how does that tie to stock valuation? And what does that mean in terms of sales and growth driving and, all kinds of things. But it's an important consideration, I think, in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of follow that there, I would think corporate boards would be thinking a lot about their company's reputation today. But you have a closer view on this. I mean, are they thinking about it enough?
I would say not yet. It's coming along. There's been a lot of conversation, and you and I and your listeners and viewers probably know some of the more recent stories that speak to the impact of consumers, what that means to major brands and consequences to some of the missteps, some of the thorny issues, and some of the missteps from some major corporate brands. Some people are familiar with Chubb and some of the headwinds and blowback that they received when they recently supported some of the underwriting for former President Trump when he was going to trial. And then Disney, of course, is one, as is Bud Light, but there are many, many others. So I look to those as examples. When we think about the stock valuation of Disney that's dropped $100 billion, when you think about the 10 or 12% decrease in revenue and stock value of Bud Light and what that meant to that distributor network and that supply chain, those were all, in my opinion, unforced errors. Whereas if there was a communications and a reputation expert on their board, and perhaps there was, I'm not sure that there was, but would that have played out the same way? Were the guardrails in there to have that conversation as to their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and the subsequent response and actions? I would contend that if they had a focus on that, as well as every other discipline on that board, that outcome could have been different.
I mean, I think you're making the case that the stakes have never been higher because of the global and the digital environment we are in right now. I mean, I have no idea how many corporate boards have a reputation expert on it. I would think everybody would have one.
It seems you would think that naturally, because you and I are certainly more aware than the average bear when it comes to the influence of consumers and what that means. But surprisingly, if you look at some of the stats, like Spencer Stewart has a document that talks about how many of the Fortune 1000 have experts on their board. And I believe of all the directors' positions for the Fortune 1000, there were only 26 that had a marketing communications background. So I think when you look to expand your board or reevaluate the skill set, this would be something that certainly should be of consideration.
Yeah. It's kind of incredible that so few have that. I mean, they obviously all have probably lawyers and finance experts and others, but that it seems like a pretty big gap
It does. And, I'm one to acknowledge there needs to be that separation from board governance to management. But it seems like, as the saying used to go, belt and suspenders. Why wouldn't you have, obviously, the ongoing operations and management component of dealing with this initiative, but also at a board level, I think there needs to be a sensitivity.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. Um, and this is why, by the way, you recently had a piece that was fantastic in the Washington Business Journal, targeted at the business community and corporate leaders to say, you need to have this representation on your board because this is such a glaring issue that I think everybody's thinking about these days. In fact, I was on a call for a nonprofit board I was on, and a head of public affairs for a Fortune 100 company said, my job this year is to keep us out of a Twitter war. Of course, we still call it Twitter, probably, even though it's X. But that was really interesting because I don't think that was the posture of folks like that a few years ago. But everybody's at that level of sensitivity. And so you're arguing you need to have that in the governance, not just in your team.
Well, because it's risk management. It's part of your ethical fiduciary responsibility as a board member. So if you're in a board environment, you can have those conversations. You can speak to stakeholder engagement. You can talk about the voice of the customer. You can also create long-term value because when you think about the fluency that you and I have and others in digital communications, that is critical. So it's not just a one-trick pony. The other thing that I think came out in the Spencer Stewart study was the idea that many of those reputation experts are diverse in and of themselves. When you think about minorities, people of color, different orientations, all of that is a wealth of beneficial information and experience that those people can bring to the board. And many of them happen to be marketing communications professionals.
Yeah, so it might bring kind of multiple things to the table.
Correct.
Not just that expertise. You mentioned some of those corporate controversies that we're aware of for the national media, and certainly there's probably a bunch of other ones that have affected companies that, haven't risen to that level, but that have had an impact on the company's value. Wonder if we could talk about that a little bit more, and particularly, a lot of leaders, I think, are struggling to balance the desire, perhaps the need to create an inclusive and diverse workplace, but also an inclusive and diverse brand to meet their customers, which is usually a pretty broad set of people. And they're balancing that with the potential for backlash. In fact, a Capitol Hill staffer recently told me ESG and DEI are both four-letter words to a lot of people in my world. And so, there's a tension there, and that tension certainly rises above the employee level to a governance board level. I wonder if you could talk about how you advise leaders and board members to navigate those tricky waters, because in today's world, saying nothing sometimes is saying something.
No, it's true. And the word tricky is apropos, so I appreciate that. The honesty of that conversation needs to be paramount. Being in touch with who you are as a brand, what your brand promises, knowing your customers, knowing the intersection of your brand, their need, both internally and externally, because, internally we're talking about recruitment, retention, we're talking about the importance of that, we're talking about supply chain partners, and we're talking about stakeholders, shareholders, externally. So being honest about that. I'll give you one example. I think we may have talked about this previously. There was one brand that we were counseling, and this was following, I guess it was 2020, and the George Floyd tragedy. And, the question was, what should we do? When should we do it? And what should it be? And having an honest conversation, in this case, with the fact that they do not have a diverse board, do not have an abundance of examples to support diverse communities, although they did in terms of hiring, but other than that, not much. And it is very tricky because you and I both know consumers have huge BS detectors.
Mm.
If you cannot say something that you can say, support, and defend, don't go there. There are other ways you can demonstrate contribution, alignment, but be careful. Remember, everybody was redoing their website and putting a statement out and things like that. So we went a little bit different route in terms of recognizing nonprofit organizations that would align with disadvantaged youth, people of color, things like that. So it was more actionable than it was messaging. And I said, and then we'll have something to talk about. But to put on when you can't, don't even
Yeah.
bother going there. That's perilous.
Yeah, I mean, one of the terms that, you hear a lot, and this is around obviously climate change, it's like greenwashing, where companies are saying that they value all this stuff, and then people sort of look under the surface of that and say, well, I don't know that you're really doing anything here. And it seems like a similar thing you're saying. If it's a big risk for your brand, if you put out a statement or you make a claim that's really not backed up by what you're doing, you have to start with action to support that before you start touting how great you are.
That's exactly right.
You mentioned consumers and the BS detector. I like that. And I want to talk a little bit about consumers. I'm wondering, though, maybe just like a way to even enter this conversation is, I mean, you ran countless successful campaigns over decades. And I wonder if you just have any favorites that you still go back to that were just, really fun, really successful that you could share with us?
Gosh, ones that we did, I mean, that's like choosing amongst your children, which is really hard. But, I'm very much, I'm sure you're aware of this, I'm very much a student of history. And particularly in my industry. In fact, I have a collection of 160 advertising icons, and I have old books about the advertising industry from the late 1800s. So when I look at the body of work during that time, I have so many heartwarming favorites. And, most of us do. When you think about advertising in general, it's your childhood memories and nostalgia. When you get that feeling of connection with the brand because of a good experience, and we can talk more about that. But I think of some of the products and some of the most memorable campaigns. Of course, some of them are still ongoing, like Smokey Bear, which is still, they're making it more contemporary year after year. But there's so many. I'm a huge fan of the 1984 Apple ad for sure, which is, going up against Big Brother. So many people have nostalgic recollections and connections to brands that happened to them when they were younger. Do you find that to be true?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think of like the old Folgers commercials, that the song that we can all still remember, and the coffee's brewing and the mom comes down and her son is home, and so, yeah, there's just so many that connect with us that I think are hard to forget.
And even more recently, I mean, well, not that recently, but Spuds McKinsey. I mean, all the Budweiser advertising is just a classic. And I mean, I'm in love with the Michelin Man, which has been around since the late 1800s. And, the whole body of work just inspires me because not only does it have an emotional connection to many of us, and I would say if you don't have an emotional connection, you're probably dead because some of these things are very meaningful.
Yeah.
But I think it really does drive the national economy, the world economy, and coming up, creating products and services for customers now. When you think about the evolution and now Airbnb or anything else that makes our life better, faster, more efficient, what will we do without a phone? I mean, an Apple phone. I was watching a technology documentary about the evolution of cell phones. My God, they were huge.
Yeah.
But it's such fun to think back on that. And many of those products were driven by creating desire and being persuasive and influencing consumers to embrace that product. I mean, it's our job to open hearts and minds and wallets.
Yeah. I mean, you just kind of walked us through, right? We talked about the 1880s to the 1980s to a little bit about today. I wonder if you could just talk about, from your perspective, how has the role of the consumer changed over the course of your career? And what does that mean for brands today?
It's interesting because it was always kind of top down. It's like, we're going to tell them about this product, this service, or us, whatever our brand was, or causes. We also represent a lot of causes. There wasn't as much measurement. There wasn't as much consumer research. I mean, it was, this is pre-internet I'm talking about. So, there's no online panels, right? It's focus groups and things like that. But we're so much more sophisticated now. So that has changed the playing field entirely about bringing a product to market for sure. But we're much more data-driven now. But now I really believe consumers are in control, and it definitely influences the products, how we roll out a product, trial use, and what have you. And the entire journey and the purchasing cycle is critical, as well as, again, reputation management.
Yeah.
What is our mutual commitment to each other, brand to consumer, consumer to brand, and what can I do to influence you to continue to purchase our brand? What kinds of things can I identify, as we call them, surprise and delight, things we can do to continue this ongoing relationship? The entire thing has changed. The consumers are in control, and the velocity of change is the biggest change of all. When I think about the early years that I was involved in, I mean, we were doing maybe quarterly reports on performance and sales and contribution from advertising. But now you and I, I'm sure, are held to much tighter constraints in terms of reporting. Sometimes it's monthly, weekly, daily, and sometimes it's real time with dashboards where we can all see what's pulling, what's not pulling, and shifting media channels on the fly.
When you talk about that real time data, one of the things I wonder is, I mean, I know we both value building partnerships rather than engaging in transactional relationships, personally and through business. And I wonder if some of the data available today can lead brands to treat their consumers as transactions, which, could get them maybe a short-term benefit, but might hurt them in the long run. And I wonder how we get them away from that. They can be addicted perhaps to those real-time results, but that's just one touch point, and we know it takes many. So I wonder if you have any perspective on that.
I do. I believe in over delivering for your customer, for your consumer, because relationships can be transactional. And if you're coming off that way, and if you're not in touch with their needs and rewarding them along the way, you risk being poached. You risk having other brands find their way into their hearts and their minds. So I mentioned surprise and delight. I mean, there's a couple different things that come to mind in that. But I think first and foremost, you have to be a problem solver. In terms of B2B professional relationships, I find to make sure that the relationships that you and I have, it's not just about, networking and hi and bye and that's it. It's what can you do for them? Sometimes it's, in your case, I'm recommending people to apply for Leadership Greater Washington, and I'm providing names for board recommendations, or I'm helping young professionals, and, things that I just do because I can, and I know it's helpful to others. But when you think about consumer products, one of the classics, which I really love, and I'm sure you've heard of this, is Chewy. The pet food company.
Yeah.
When a pet passes away, they'll actually refund the money for the unused food.
Oh.
Yeah, and then they will send a condolence note and send flowers.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
So I'm not going to forget Chewy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's more than a transaction. That's somebody who knows me, understands what I've just lived through, or my family's lived through. That's one example. I found another one that was equally as impressive. There was a young lady who had posted on, I think it was Insta, where she said her Tabasco sauce had been confiscated at the airport. And, this was part of the Tabasco mindset. They said, well, okay, we're going to identify this young lady and send her mini
Mm,
Tabasco sauces so that she could get through security at the
yeah.
airport. So those kinds of episodes enmesh you with a brand over and above just going to the grocery store or ordering online and looking for the best price.
Well, and I think, you know, part of what I hear in that, Carrie, is in today's environment, while it would always be great to do either of those things, the Chewy example or the Tabasco example, the ripple effects today can be so much greater because in both of those examples, people have heard about it who don't know these people, right? Because they saw it on social media or, you know, whatever, versus traditional word of mouth just couldn't travel as widely or as fast as things can travel today through technology. And so that's one of the factors that I suspect puts consumers in a place of control more than they used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
We haven't talked about AI yet. And I mean, look, it's hard for any of us to predict exactly where any of this stuff is going to go other than we know it's going to make its mark. But I'd love to know what perspective you have on AI's influence on the marketing and communications industry, as well as how that intersects with the changing role of the consumer.
Yeah, that it's on the tip of everyone's lips, right? So, and not to mention the boardroom. I mean, the number of mentions in stock and board reports is amazing. But when you think about AI, so many people are in the Chicken Little kind of phase. It's like, oh, OMG, what am I going to
Yeah.
do kind of thing. On the other hand, I'm kind of two minds. I understand that, and AI for good and AI for bad. But when you think about, as we do and as I do, AI is a co-pilot. The judgment still counts. There are some issues and proclivities that you need to be concerned with in terms of your garden, your walled garden, and where you're getting information from, and biases, and is it accurate, and things like that. And what kind of investment are you going to work? The larger brands are creating their own AI walled garden
Yeah.
kind of institute, if you will, but which protects your information. But it's such a huge issue right now. It reminds me of initially when the internet came to be, and many predict it'll go beyond that. I see it for good. I think judgment is key. I think putting an advisory panel in major brands and in agencies to drive that usage, exposure, growth. You got to consider legal liability and exposure that goes with that as well. And then what is the investment? Because in our world, who would want to hire us if we weren't competitive and used AI as a tool?
Right.
Because it is an efficiency play, but the judgment that is layered on top of AI is really where the value is in
Yeah.
our services for sure.
Yeah, and it makes me think in the marketing and communication space, um, well, while there used to be maybe more room for organizations that were high execution, low strategy, hey, I'm going to tell my agency what I want, but they're just going to be the hands and feet that get it all done. Now, I think if you're an agency and you're providing advice, you have to bring a high level of strategy because there are more and more tools out there to do the execution, and they're looking for that. And I know that's always been a big part of what you've done with your clients is bring that high level of strategy and sort of trusted partner. But my view, that is going to be more necessary than ever. And organizations that maybe don't offer that, they may be at a disadvantage with all of this new technology.
I totally agree. And on a tactical level, using it in media planning and buying, certainly reporting, even account management for sure. But using it as a foundational tool, like any other tool, really. When you think about production, even and resizing of ads, and for digital applications and things like that, it's critical. And it's kind of the table stakes for research. So you again got to be careful with attribution. What is the source and what have you? But it is an efficiency play, and I think it will continue to be that. And I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out what is that mix. Also, having a open conversation with clients on shared information, what that looks like. And again, liability and exposure. I know I sound like an attorney, but it's an important part of that, particularly now because it's new.
Yeah. I remember when we were getting going at Social Driver, companies that would ban their employees from using social media, like financial services companies. And then you fast forward not too long, and those companies are, hiring us to train those same people who used to be banned to use social media better to do their jobs because, in the financial industry space, they want to make sure that they're getting their brand up there. And I sort of wonder if that's a little bit of what might happen with AI in some of these corporate environments, because there are some companies that are saying, no, you can't use it. And then, pretty quickly, you're starting to see that break a little bit. It's being integrated into so many tools like Microsoft Office and so forth. It's hard to have a complete ban on it. You wouldn't be able to use anything. But having some guidelines and maybe more quickly moving to figure out, okay, how do we integrate this? And then that goes to the point of the governance, right? I mean, and making sure there's some sort of governance, that may be board governance, that may be other corporate governance over using these tools.
Yeah, it's part of an entire industry conversation. I just came back from Capitol Hill yesterday where privacy, data privacy, and a number of other issues that are impacting our industry. But one of the hottest conversations was around AI and the impact and what that looks like. What is legislation going to look like? How are we implementing this? How are we rolling out? What does that conversation look like? So it's a hot topic, but I feel your pain when you talk about those conversations when people are kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And again, it feels like that moment in time where we have to kiss change on the lips because it's perilous not to.
Yeah.
Competitors, many times when I counsel brands, I use competitors as examples. I use very often Harvard Business Review case studies and, promote trial use of things that clients are either ambivalent about or fearful of as a way to get them to wade into the water a bit, because I want our brands to win. I don't want them to be held back. On the other hand, it has to be responsible. So balancing those two is difficult, but necessary.
Right. Switch gears just a second. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, do you think leaders showing up on social media is important to their brand's reputation?
I do. And again, that gets back to getting people to wade into things that they're not either comfortable with or they don't have enough time. The difference is for those corporate executives that do utilize social media tools to advance their personal brand, it has a huge impact on their perception, their opportunities, and the command of the space that they're in. You're a leader in this area. When we were talking about thought leadership, there's many people that want to be thought leaders or consider themselves thought leaders that don't have any thoughts. I have to attribute that to Liz Wanger, but I think that's true. You can say you want to be a thought leader, and there's a number of ways to do that, but I think social media is one of the most efficient, if not the most effective ways to do that. And I am a huge supporter because it's not just about your brand or your cause or your company. It's about you too. Yeah. And a great way to do that and a brilliant way to do that is through social media.
Yeah. And I've been saying a lot lately, faces are the new logos. I mean, we live in this era where all the surveys show that trust in institutions and brands is, not heading in a great direction. People trust other people. And it kind of goes back to that whole thing of, Congress always has a bad approval rating, but my member of Congress always does better, right, than the Congress as a whole. And so showing up as a face, as an individual who can make an authentic human connection, that certainly makes a big difference. And so for the personal brand, for one's career, great, but also it can do so much for their corporate brand too, when they have great, spokespeople is really the lingo we used to use. But now, I mean, you don't have to be an official spokesperson to be an ambassador for your brand.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, you only need to look at, and I'm sure you follow this as well, the Edelman Trust Barometer for when you talk about reputation. They recently had one that came out for corporate boards. and, the importance of that, or even RepTrack, which is a global reputation tracking device. But it is as much the brand, the performance, and their leaders. And now more than ever, because of the digital environment, the ecosystem that we're in, you're missing one of the levers if you're not taking advantage of social media to advance your cause, your message, your thought leadership, and what you support. And I just want to emphasize what you said. People want to work with and for people they know, trust, and admire. And if you're not using that channel, you're at a deficit.
Yeah, 100%. Well, lastly, I just want to ask you before we wrap up, we know that you have so much experience in both business and communications and marketing. I'm wondering if there are any places outside of those spheres that you get inspiration for the work you do, how you show up, how you influence. What inspires you?
People inspire me. You inspire me. Everyday CEOs. No, you do. Entrepreneurs, even if they're starting up, I remember that feeling. I remember that passion. And I would also say that I'm a student of others. So because, I started at such an early age, people like John Hendricks, who discovered Discovery, Ted Leonsis, of AOL legacy, but now Monumental Sports, Kevin Plank, guys that had ideas and inspiration and the tenacity to go out and make something happen. Steve Jobs, there's others in my industry, Shelley Lazarus, the former chairman of Ogilvy and Mather. But even more recently, people like Cricket Witten with Spanx, people who followed their passion, followed their dream. Many of these people started their companies with a credit card. And many of them ended up making payroll with a credit card, because you go through those peaks and valleys. And I've always loved the underdog, similar to the story about Rudy, for the people who are always told what they can't do, and then they prevail. That's what inspires me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really great way to conclude, because as we heard, there were a lot of people who, underestimated you when you became the owner and CEO of an agency at the age of 30, and you've proven them all wrong. And you've certainly probably exceeded even your own expectations, I'm guessing, with all that you've accomplished. And I think it was so amazing to hear from you about this idea of influence, because when we think about influence, you're influencing boardrooms when you're presenting to them, but then you're also in those boardrooms and you're on the other end of that. And so you bring perspectives from both sides, which very few people do, to help brands navigate their reputation and what matters, and how they meet their consumer, which has changed a lot and is continuing to change. So really just incredible to get to speak with you. Again, somebody I've known for a long time. So to get to speak with you in this way was just a unique treat, because we haven't had this exact conversation before. And I just want to say thank you and congratulations on your recognition as a chief influencer.
I'm delighted. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a chief influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time,